So good morning and thank you all for showing up at this early hour. I have a lot of words. I'll be quoting some of them and I'll be saying a few things that are not on the projector. I hope everybody can read this. What I'll try to do in the next 30-35 minutes is give you an overview of what happens in the European Union at the public administration level in regards to open source. I'll be talking about the big trends, some policies, and I'll give you lots of examples. The first few slides are from the monthly newsletter that we publish at the European Commission. We try to editorialize a little bit the things that happened that month. And we notice a few long-term trends that are important for public administrations. For example, that public administrations start to realize that if they move from proprietary software to open source software, they move from having a sunk cost IT budget into an investment budget, where they pay it forward and their contributions to open source projects actually go back into society. And it's one of the things, as written here, the virtuous loop between the private and the public sector, that they find very interesting. This is something that is increasingly being realized by public administrations. So an argument is software is paid for by the taxpayers, so therefore it should go back to the taxpayers in as easy a form as possible. And the open source license is a very practical way to give it back. A good example, this yellow link here, I will share the presentation with you later, and all those little links are clickable. They go to articles on the website. Here you have public administrations from a Swiss canton, a German city, a French ministry. They all put a bit of money together to pay Collabora, who were here yesterday, to develop better support, for example, a proprietary document format, OXML. And this is also a very interesting argument that comes up every now and then, which I hope people here will pay attention to and use it when they talk to public administrations. It's a public administration, and the source code these public administrations create, either they pay for it or they write it themselves, is information, much as other information. And there is a certain argument to be made that this source code should be made public. The link is actually a very interesting example in France, where a researcher said, the personal tax application that I use online to fill in my tax return, can I see the code, please, so that I know that the 100 euros that I fill in is actually the 100 euros that is followed through the system and that is in my tax return? And the ministry said, oh, no, that's far too big an application to open source. That's like so many files on so many different computers, we can never do that. And the researcher, he's a big data researcher, said, yeah, I don't mind. So he went to the court that deals with these things when the public administration says no to a freedom of information request. And the court considered both arguments and said, well, okay, yeah, it's complex, but complexity shouldn't be a reason not to do it. So now the ministry was forced to make it available. It hasn't been doing that yet. As I say, it's a lot of files over a lot of computers, but it's an interesting thing to watch. And it would be nice if other countries did similar things. That was a hint. Preparing my talk, I have this slide and I give this talk regularly, but I put in a slide on Croatia, and then I thought, hey, this country is much further ahead than I realized. You guys actually seem to know what you're doing on this topic. So, you know, you have your pension system, and this is a headline that caught a lot of attention. You have a very active community. This is the 22nd year that you're doing this conference. I think that makes you the oldest open source conference in Europe, so my compliments. You have a working group in the government, which apparently is a little bit in limbo at the moment, but if you guys give it a bit of a push, it might come back alive again. And that is actually quite important, that you start having people in public administrations. That is a starting point for getting this discussion. So that was my introduction. I'd like to first thank you very much for inviting me here. It's wonderful to visit Zagreb. It's a fantastic city. It's nice to know that it is the birthplace of the pen, because as a writer I love pens, of course. And a little bit about me. I'm an IT journalist. I've been writing about open source for Dutch IT trade publications for a while. And then I was extremely lucky to see sort of a job posting where they were looking for somebody that understood open source and public administrations. And I said, yes, 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 pick me. And so they picked me. And I started working in 2006, 2007 for the OSOR, which stands for the Open Source Observatory and Repository. And it's a project by the European Commission. It's a teeny-weeny project where they try to get public administrations to share their applications in any form. And again, open source, there's a license, is the most practical way to do that. And so if we find an application written by a public administration that is useful for others, we try to put it in the repository. In 2012, this project was mixed with a bunch of other projects on the JoinUp website. So now it's a community on JoinUp running on Drupal 6. We're moving to Drupal 7 in the course of this year. And as I said, it's a very small project by the European Commission, but the Commission likes open source. They use it a lot themselves. They understand where it's going. There's, of course, the Commission is a very big public administration, so there's lots of different forces, but the project is still there. So, Gesundheit. First, the big trends. Public administrations really increasingly use open source everywhere. This is a quote from the French Gendarmerie, which is very effective. It lowers your total cost of ownership by 40%. Now, I know that costs for public administrations are actually not the most important argument, but this one says a lot. And the Gendarmerie, and I will explain a little bit later on, they also say it's not only a cost thing, but it's a management tool. And another big trend is that the number of politicians that understand open source, that know what this is about, that actually use it themselves, or that go into a parliament using a laptop that runs Fedora or OpenSUSE or Debian, is increasing. It's not increasing very fast. Again, that's something that you guys can help with, but it's increasing. Here are the Twitter links to two MEPs in the European Parliament, Julia Rede and Max Anderson, who are currently quite active on open source. They both wrote a proposal that forces the European Commission to build a list of all the open source applications that are already in use and to do security audits and give back to the community. They're creating quite a stir. And I said Croatia already seems to know everything about it, because here you have your former president with a very complimentary quote. It was in 2012 when he was speaking at this conference. They use it, public administrations use open source literally everywhere. This is a list, it's random, there's not listed by priority, but they use it for, most obviously, content management systems, for document management systems, a lot of databases, a lot of their e-government services. They don't advertise it, and when I try to find, for example, as I work for the Commission, I have to write about all the 28 member states. So sometimes, I have to write an item quickly about Lithuania because I haven't paid attention to it the last 3 months. I'll go to one of the e-services and I'll start doing what's that site running and looking at the code and trying to figure out which content management system it is. And then I call the ministry and they say, hey, actually you're using Drupal? And we do. And then I drill down the ministry and find the guy who does the IT and he starts talking. And that's how I discover a new case. It's used across all sectors. It's in the EU institutions. The Commission just earlier this year updated its open source policy. It's worthwhile checking out. The main thing there that they add is, as I already said, they use it almost everywhere at the desktop a little bit, but mostly at the server end. They're now trying to take it very seriously that they give back fixes and bug fixes and code that they develop in the house to the upstream projects. it's one of the problems that I'll signal later on, that public administrations don't really know how to do that. And the Commission is just an example of one of those that doesn't really know how to contact Debian, for example, or how to contact Fedora. And they need a bit of help with that, something we're trying to do. This link that I just increased a little bit, I think it's a hint to the future. The EC does these gigantic rounds where they hire new staff, and last year they did a big round where they try to find new IT people working for a project on the Commission inside the Commission buildings. And one of the exam questions was, if you were to migrate one of the departments to open source, how would you do that? There were 200 people that wrote that exam, so now they have 200 scenarios. They didn't make them public, but you know, I'm working on that too. Excuse me. It's in ministries all over the EU. It's an interesting one because Germany is one of the weakest countries, I find. Being such a big powerhouse in the European Union, you would expect Linux to be used a bit more, but it's used by the German finance minister. The French Interior Ministry is very clear about the advantages. In Finland, in Poland, in Spain, in Norway, in Estonia. It's used in capital cities, villages, tiny villages. Zaragoza, Madrid, Bilbao. You can read all that. I'll just make them a little bit larger for those who are semi-blind like me. And it's really, that is always really nice to see the number. If you talk about the numbers, you can call any public administration these days, get through to the IT department, and they'll say, yeah, of course we use, and then they'll rattle off a whole bunch of applications. It's in healthcare. It's actually a lot in healthcare. There's something happening there. It's in schools, but there was a talk about that yesterday. Hang on. This last quote is interesting to read. It's the West Highlands School for Girls. And there the IT manager said, look, we have to move the whole school to, I think it was Ubuntu. And this is how he explained it. These kids are supposed to work, they have a potential career at CERN or at Google. Then it's nice if they already know a little bit about Linux. So let's start now. And that's totally true. It's used in defense. If you go to a Dutch marine ship, it's basically a floating Linux data center. It's a bit of a public secret. NATO uses ODF. Not only, but they also use ODF. And this last one is interesting because Putin at a certain point said, okay, this whole dependency on American software is maybe not such a good idea. Let's move everything to open source. But the day before he announced that policy, two of his close business associates bought a French IT service provider, and they bought the Russian Alt Linux IT service provider. So they knew where this was going, which also means that it's serious. It's not just Windows dressing. I have 4 problems for you. I said the number of politicians was increasing, but this is really the first problem. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence that tells me that this is the most important thing to fix. You need to get your politicians to understand the pros and cons of open source, the long-term benefits, and then you can talk about the costs, and you can talk about being socially responsible and paying it forward and sharing with others, and why should one municipality build an application for driving licenses and then have the neighbor municipality pay for it again, why they can all pool it. There are now hundreds of examples where a municipality builds a tool, gives it to the neighbors, and they use it because it's open source. And they both build on a future version, and you have a small town that starts it, and then you have a big city that says, hey, that's actually interesting, we can fold it into our data center. And then they say, but it needs to, now it needs to support PostgreSQL instead of MySQL. And they just do that, and they give it back to the others. And as I said, there's anecdotal evidence, and there was research done just last year on basically all the articles that I wrote on Dutch municipalities over the past years, where these guys, there's a typo, where these guys concluded that if you have a politician in the city council that understands this a bit, and you can talk to them as HR Open and as HULC, then it'll make him or her ask for more open source at the IT department. And if you have somebody at the IT department, he is what we call them innovation people, innovators, innovation champions. They need to be able to talk and talk and talk and talk and talk, and they get rid of all the resistance to change. But if you have those two, you can do this. Of course, they don't need to then be voted out or rotated to a different department. That's tricky. But if you have these people, then you can get your public administration to switch. The second problem, and I will not really talk about this a lot, though it's, as a journalist, this is really interesting because this is sort of where the battle happens. But the desktop is very much locked in. Okay. Even the European Commission knows this. They have not procured the desktop operating system or the desktop office solutions in 20 years. Because they don't have a choice. So they've done all these tricks. And now they say we should do procurement according to the rules, and then they break the rules themselves. So it's a bit of a do as I say, not do as I do, but that's how it is. And the third problem, which I just mentioned, is procurement. I think that 1 in 5 procurement proposals that is published across the EU actually breaks the rules when it comes to IT, because they just ask for SAP or IBM this or Microsoft that, and that's just not how it is supposed to be. You're supposed to procure cars and not beamers. Many people are trying to do something about that. This is not one of the core topics of my project, but of course, sometimes I see these procurement proposals and I will call the public administration and try to get them to explain why they did this and why they think they can go ahead with that. I'll give you one great anecdote that I hope will work as a hint here. In Poland, there is a group, the free software group in Poland, FWIOO, and they had a project that monitored all public administration procurement proposals. They were sponsored by the Ministry of Economics, which was very nice. And every 3 months they did a little report, and every 2 or 3 weeks they put a little notice on their website, which I would then Google Translate and try to write something about. And they had, for example, they discovered this proposal by the United Fire Departments from across Poland. And they asked for Microsoft this, and IBM that, and Oracle so. And they contacted the fire department and say, yeah, you're not allowed to do that. That's not how these rules work. But the fire department didn't, of course, react. But I noticed that in the proposal it said that the project was funded by the European Regional Development Fund, which is in Brussels. Coincidentally has a Dutch spokesperson whom I happen to know, so I called him. And I said, Hans, listen, this is Poland fire department, and they're breaking the rules. Oh, that's really nice that you tell me. I'll make a note. And when they send us the invoice, we'll tell them, sorry guys, you break the rules, so we can't pay that. So I quickly called the Polish guys and the fire department saying, yeah, now the European Regional Development Fund is not going to pay your project. So they withdrew that tender. And they published it again, and it was more neutral. And another example was there was a Romanian police force came with a procurement proposal where they forbade the GPL to be part of the solutions, which was interesting because then I had to know why, right? So I called them, and I don't speak Romanian very well at all, actually. And I upset the whole hierarchy in the office because the secretary did speak English. So I got the secretary of the boss, and she started giving orders to her boss, give me the file on. And so they started looking, and they withdrew that proposal as well. It wasn't me who did that, but it's nice to have a little bit of influence there. And again, you have a former MEP, Anna's daughter. Some of these MEPs understand what's going on and how this doesn't help local companies. And if you're really into this, this is a link to a study done by a guy who did his PhD on this project. And he he completely makes mincemeat out of the European Commission's argument that they have a loophole that they can use to not procure open source in the Commission. He says what they do is totally illegal, and he also contacted them, and of course the Commission hasn't replied. We're working on that. And the fourth problem, the last one, it's not really very big, but it's there, is that public administrations are a little bit shy and a little bit unsure of how to do this. The Commission, as I said, updated its open source policy this year, and the main new thing is that they say is it's time for us to give back, but they don't know how. They don't know. So they hire a company to do some code on Drupal. Then they find a bug, and they fix the bug. But now, who fixed it? Was it the Commission, or was it the company, or was it the coder in the company? And who owns the copyright? And whose name do we put on the code, and where do we send it? That's a really practical question. And you get this all over Europe. We have ministries that ask the same question. Okay, so the government wants us to do open source. Where do we find the community? It's a different culture. And so communities can help there. And of course, projects like the FSFE and CLUC and projects like the OSOR also help. And there are already a lot of examples that show that public administrations do understand it. EMEO in Belgium is an IT service provider. It used to be a public administration IT service department. It became independent. But they basically only do open source. And they have more than 200 municipalities that they service on Python and Zopi, on their content management. And all these municipalities work together on their electronic government services. One city develops it, and the other 200 cities then roll it out. Another interesting one is the Dutch government recently needed something to be fixed in their EID tooling. It's part of the Apache Foundation. That's the software that they use. They hired, it's under the procurement threshold. I asked that too. So they didn't need to publish a procurement proposal, but they hired a New Zealand specialist who does this code to say, can you do support for ISO, SEN, number, blah, 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 and he did. And they made sure that it was under the GPL back into the Apache project by hiring the guy. That was easy. Switzerland's Supreme Court. It's also a very interesting case because it actually had to take itself to court. Now this is the court in Switzerland, and they have a document management system that they built themselves. And when it was done, they thought, okay, now it's done. So we might as well give it back to the community. So they published it under, I think, the European Union public license. It doesn't really matter. Under an open source license. And they made it available. And I started writing about it, and the Swiss IT press started writing about it. And then there was a proprietary vendor who also has a document management system that he is trying to sell to the Swiss courts in the cantons, in the regions. And he said, hey, this is unfair commercial competition. You should, not be making software. You should be, putting stamps and giving licenses and doing court things, but not software building. And they took the court to court. They took the court to their own court, because it was the Supreme Court to start with. Well, so the Supreme Court looked at the whole thing, and they said, okay, so this commercial tool is actually not entirely the same as that open source tool. They do two different things, so there is no competition. Besides, they are not commercial. The only thing they did is make it available. If people want to use it, they can, but there is no service, no support. So the commercial guys lost their case. But it's interesting. That has only happened once, as far as I know. ADULACT is a French volunteer organization for public administrations using open source. It's very big. France is very big, but there's many people there that are a member of this ADULACT association. It was actually the model for the OSOR by the European Commission. And Open Mairie is a project started by Arles in the south of France, not a very big city, but they have over 200 applications, all available as open source. And they have hundreds of towns in France using their tools. I did this talk in the Czech Republic, and there were people from Belgium there, And I talked about one of the tools that we as journalists like most is it's the tool to manage cemeteries called Open Cemetery, Open Cimetière. And we like it because it writes great headlines. And it's not a very actively developed tool. But the Belgians said, hey, actually, we were looking for something like that. And so during the talk, one of the IT guys downloaded it from the OSOR and said, yeah, well, it actually would work. So now they're implementing it in Belgium. So that's 201. For the people that get tired of my voice, I'm almost done. Something that is important for public administrations, I actually quite often get this request. What are the other countries, what are the other regions doing? So in the room we have the author of this report, sitting right there. Report on policies and initiatives on sharing and reuse, where she looked at all the, Clémentine Valère, she looked at all the policies that are out there currently that help make the argument that I've been talking about the past 15, 20 minutes. And she notices that all the EU member states address sharing and reuse. They all see how this is valuable. Half of them now have legislation that is not always mandatory, but a lot of them have legislation that actually helps other public administrations in that country say, hey, we have a policy, let's do this. It's not mandatory, but it's there, let's do this. And these policies and legislations work by listing standards that they can use. Of course, a lot of them are completely open door at the IT stack, but some of them, for example, will contain ODF. And a lot of them have a policy on the sharing and reuse of software that includes then open source licenses. I'll very quickly run through the top 3 of the most visible open source projects in Europe. And I'm sure all of you know about these. The biggest one is the French Gendarmerie. It currently has 72,000 Ubuntu desktops. That is, I think, worldwide the biggest. And I already quoted Stéphane Dumont, the guy who is one of the project leaders there, who said, so yeah, we save an enormous amount of costs, but that's not really the big advantage. By having gone to open source, we actually have leverage on our IT suppliers. We are managing them instead of they managing us, and we can actually steer our IT strategy instead of our IT strategy steered by the vendors. And it lowers the costs by 40%. And there's a great anecdote that I would like to share. It's one of his colleagues spoke in 2009 at a conference. And these guys don't speak that often. And he said, so France, it's a big country, but it goes all the way to Australia because you have French Oceania, which has a lot of islands off the coast between Hawaii and Australia. And so one of the guys always has to fly to Australia and then get on a boat and then on a canoe, and he has to go from all those islands to visit the police posts to update the virus definitions for the antivirus tools. And then he goes all the way back. And by the time he gets back to Paris, they give him a new set of CDs, and he can go straight back. It took him a year to do this, and then, he was always flying. He said, so now we run Ubuntu. We don't have the problem. We can do this remotely, updates. So he doesn't have to fly anymore. It's a great anecdote. Though it's a pity if you like flying to Oceania. The next biggest example is the government of Extremadura. Their target is to have all 42,000 desktops run Ubuntu. They're not there yet. One of the things that is interesting there is that they're locked in. They realize that. And they have a young CIO, and he says, yeah, I know this more than my former older colleagues. But this is where they are. They have already 10,000 PCs in healthcare organizations, that's hospitals, but also pharmacies and other medical institutes in the region using a version of Ubuntu, it's translated and there's some tools added. And they have 22,000 PCs in government offices that will use about sometime this year, start using this. And this is a real kicker I always find, but I'm sure that yesterday you heard that. All across Spain you can find massive amount of PCs that do a boot. And this is one of the examples. And the third one, probably the most famous one, is the city of Munich in Germany. 14,800 PCs, Linux, Ubuntu Linux, and LibreOffice. And this is a nice quote that Mr. Ude tells himself, he likes to tell himself. And his English is not fantastic, so when he has this thick German accent. And this is in the car. He was at a conference in California, and Bill Gates heard of that and said, hey, Mr. Ude, can I pick you up and bring you to the airport? Then we have 30 minutes to talk. And Mr. Ude said, yeah, sure. So this van with dark windows shows up at the hotel, and Mr. Ude gets in, and there's Bill Gates. And so Bill Gates asks, what's your problem? Why are you doing this? And as I said, Ude doesn't speak, he's not fluent in English, so he has to think a bit, and he says, well, to gain freedom. So Bill Gates is quiet for, say, 2 miles. He's not driving, I guess. I wasn't there. And freedom from what? Well, from you, Mr. Gates. That was the end of the conversation, according to Mr. Ude. So the rest of the trip to the airport was silent. There's another quote from him where he said, so at that conference, he also met Steve Ballmer. And Steve Ballmer was eager to get the guy to turn sides. And so he was offering him this and that, and 0 licenses, and 0 cost, and for all your schools, and for all your libraries. And Ude sat there. Yeah, and what else? And then so Ballmer continued adding more free stuff, and services, and guarantees. And then Ude said, yeah, and what else? And later, Ballmer spoke to Neelie Kroes, the former commissioner. He said, yeah, this German Ude, man, he's a tough negotiator. And we said, I just don't speak English. I don't know, I forgot to ask if there are public administrations in the room. Okay, guess not. Well, then you should tell them this. These are, I call them deep, these are deep examples of policies across the EU that are really useful to look at and to replicate. The first one is, let's see if this, yeah. I'll make them a bit bigger. First one is Sweden, where they looked at the problems that public administrations have with open source. And I told you already how to contribute back, where to get support. And is that you guys will fix this for you. We'll do one big blanket open source service contract, and it has all these tools in them. And if you use, let's say, Alfresco or Red Hat, you can go to one of these 5 vendors and get the support. You just use this framework contract. We have done all the details. And when you find the bug fix, the vendor is made responsible for giving it back to the community under the right license, etc. Norway is just as interesting. It's a bunch of municipalities just north of Oslo that decided to run their own tools, picked open source, and they run them in a cloud, and they're becoming very popular across the rest of Norway. The only danger here that I see is that it's cloud-based, and as a public administration, you don't see on the website that it says open source. So they might lose the incentive to contribute back. A little town in the north that finds a bug fix, who knows? Am I doing okay for time? Okay. Okay. Belgium, I already mentioned it, so I can skip it a bit, but it's literally in the French-speaking part of Belgium, a lot of municipalities are working together on Zopi, Python applications. France is a country that really has an open source culture. I have no idea whether this is inspired by some sentiment of being different from the rest or a sentiment of being opposite America. It doesn't really matter in the end, but they really like open source at all levels. They understand it, they support the vendors, they support startups. There's always a lot of interesting anecdotes coming from that country. And the United Kingdom, they should almost get an award for having such a strong ODF policy that they decided on last year, because it's changing a lot in the UK. Very slow to come. You do not find a lot of public administration in the country actually using this intensively, but it will come. So if you're a public administration and you are wondering, so how do I do this? Where do I start? What do I do? I have 5 steps. The first step is to do like the UK. you make the use of open standards mandatory, and you make ODF one of them. That's for the desktop, but it's important. And you're being very, very serious to make sure you create a level playing field for both sides, for open source and proprietary software vendors. And you make your main CIO, your main IT guy, responsible for it. So he has to, take it to heart. Then you do similar to the Canary Islands in Spain. They have a very smart CIO there who argued a long time with the political leadership and said, look, if I save a lot of money by moving from Oracle to Postgres, which he did, or which he is doing, can I keep the budget that I saved, because the license costs that go down and the support costs that go down, can I keep it so I can invest in other things? And he said, sure, you can keep it for 4 years. It gives him wiggle room to do other things, because in many other towns, they say, okay, great, so it's saved, thank you very much, and it's gone. And the proprietary vendors know this, and they abuse this. I'll give you a few examples. In Germany, sorry, I forget the town, but there is a town that wanted to move to LibreOffice, and the moment the proprietary vendor of Office Suites heard about this, they filed a claim for license violations. And it was, I think, $500,000, and that was the open source experiment budget. Exactly the same happened in a few Dutch towns, where the proprietary vendor figured out, hey, they're doing things on OpenOffice and LibreOffice, or they're talking about it. Let's say I want a license sniffer in your network, and then you will always discover that the public administration hasn't figured out their licenses properly. Oh, you're home, you have people working at home, and you didn't pay for the licenses. That'll be 300,000 euros, please, which, of course, is exactly the amount that the city council previously had reserved for open source. And then you have these councillors scrambling, where do I find that money? Because they have budgets. Oh, here's an open source budget, and then there goes the money. So, third step, you do similar to the Basque Country or to Munich. You do it everywhere. And you promote diversification, and you make sure that there is a chance for the local IT industry. And as I said in the beginning, you pay it forward and do not make it a sunk cost. And then 4, similar to the gendarmerie in France, you realize that open source gives you an argument, an arm to wrestle with, and that it improves everything across your IT industry, across your IT infrastructure. It's a way to manage the rest. And this is very practical. You do it similar to a Dutch city, which is very successful. They show that if you do this seriously, you can reduce your license costs by 92%. This is the first city where we were able to look at the costs of the city and then compare it to the IT costs of cities that were compared of the same size. And their IT budget is 30% lower, and their license costs go down by 92%. And here's how they did it. They just said, look, Firefox, it's a cross-platform. It works on all machines. So that's our browser, which meant the suppliers had to get rid of a lot of proprietary tools. And that was that. I hope I was clear enough and brief enough. And the slides are available. And if there are any questions, this will be your moment.
Thank you. So, are there any questions for our keynote speaker? Yes, please.
I'm interested about agreement that proprietary software made with locals about last case you mentioned about transferring to open source. Because I was on some lectures about TTIP, and there was some investors agreement that were suing local governments. Do you know any such case related to software? Because when transferring to open source, that investors lose their profits, or proprietary software vendors lose their profits.
I'm not sure I got your question. Can you?
About proprietary, do you know more cases about proprietary vendors suing for
Yes.
transitioning to open source because they lose their profits.
Yes. In almost every EU member state. I haven't seen one in Croatia, but I haven't looked hard enough. But you can find it everywhere.
Yes, because in Croatia we are very tight with Microsoft systems.
Yeah. So I gave you the German example, and they were particularly irritated by the license cost that they all of a sudden had to incur, and it actually made them more motivated to go away. But it was expensive. The Dutch city of Enschede just lost their IT experimental budget that way. The Dutch city of Ede had to pay the Dutch city of Arnhem, that's 3 in the Netherlands, that I happen to know because people talk to me about it. There's a famous case in Spain where I think the city of Zaragoza, but I could be wrong, could also be somewhere in Andalusia, a region or a city was sued for the licenses on schools. And I don't know how many of you people have read proprietary licenses. You will always break the licenses. So it's easy. It's really easy for a big vendor to say, okay, well, you have your database, but actually 2 users, so that's 2 seats. Or yeah, it's virtual machine, but that makes it 10 seats. Or it's a mess. And that happens everywhere. And the proprietary vendors, they see where this is going long term, and they have a bit of a war chest to make sure that it stops. It's not the biggest thing, but it happens. Yeah, a lot of the groups like CLUC and OpenAR are working in the country, talking to their politicians. But the big vendors, yeah, they have an international agenda, and they just organize this at the EU or a global level. It's easy. They send an email to the right person who hops into his car, drives to the parliament, talks to the right person, settles this, quiets it down. It's good for local jobs too, and so on. They're better organized than we are, but that doesn't mean that you don't stand a chance, by the way.
Yeah. Thank you. Any more questions? Yes, please.
And this talk is not about us versus them. That's not the whole thing. Public administrations realize long-term this is much smarter to do. It's more efficient and so on.
This is not so much question. This is only suggestion for one measure. I suggest that measure for corruption is using proprietary code in administration, education, and public health.
There's definitely something there. Yeah, there's a big case in Romania at the moment against a whole bunch of proprietary service providers that have basically bought public administrations. So, but these things are coming out, and in Bulgaria, I have a few hints that. Projects are given free licenses, which are then written off as donations, so it's tax for the proprietary vendor, and it's a nice lock-in for the library and the school. So, but again, if you talk to your politicians, that's where this change will come from. It's the focus. That's what I'm trying to tell you guys. That's where you need to focus.
Yeah, hi. I would like to ask you, can you tell us about migrating internal applications and systems from proprietary providers? Because a lot of applications are in-house developed with external help, and a lot of money is put in those applications and solutions. And migrating from, let's say, Microsoft environment to open source environment would suggest that a lot of money would be, again, put in these applications, solutions, such as in-house application for, let's say, procurement and stuff. And how did these, let's say, Munich and other European citizen countries came to a solution to the, I don't know how to say, how did they solve this issue of, again, developing and paying for these in-house solutions or external applications? Thank you.
I think you want a much more technical answer from me than I can possibly give you. I do know, what I can tell you is that from the public administrations that made the switch, on the desktop side, you can liberate 80% of your desktops, and 20%, and that's usually the accounting department, will use some kind of proprietary tool. And it's AutoCAD, not at the finance department, I think, and Excel. However, just yesterday I published an article on the school in Spain, Leon, city of Leon, where they had the same problem. Their staff needed some accounting tools, and it was Excel sheets with all kinds of complicated macros, and they didn't know how to migrate this quickly to LibreOffice. So they took Office 365 on Ubuntu, problem solved, and it gave the IT department enough time to look at, so what is this thing actually doing, to then program it in LibreOffice and get rid of it. But usually the fight is over the budget, which is why I gave the Spanish example, the Canary Islands, where he says, if I save money, can I use it to make sure that I fix the other problems too? And on the server, when it comes to big database applications, I no first-hand experience, but from what I hear from public administrations that I have spoken to, it is easier than you think to move to Postgres from Oracle. But you will waste money. And it is actually, you should have thought about this before, of course. The thing is, you need to give the right title to that cost, because most people call it migration cost, but that's not what it is. It's an exit cost. It's because you didn't think about it good enough 5 years ago that now you're stuck. And you should have added that price, the exit cost, to the procurement 5 years ago. And that's what OpenHR and HULC and other groups need to tell their politicians. These are not migration costs. These are lock-in costs that are part of the other budget, not part of the new budget. So, and that the city council needs to know. And again, you have a lot of work to do, because most city councils, when I speak to them and you talk about computers, you go, oh my God, that's the IT department, right? I don't want nothing to do with it. And that's of course wrong, because everything we do these days is IT. No IT, no government. So that means the government needs to know IT.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. We need to move on with our schedule, so if there are any more questions, you can ask the speaker on the pause or during the lunch. So, thank you very much, and please accept this traditional gift. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. And see you.